Hi, and welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think. My name is Ariane Rice, and I am an Episcopal priest and leadership coach, and I am thrilled you are listening to this podcast. Today, I want to do something a little different. I've done it once before, just had a solo episode, not host a conversation, and I wanted to do that again. Now, if you are listening to this podcast, then I know something about you. I know that you are a person who cares about listening. How do I know this? Well, number one, because I'm a person that cares about listening, which is one of the reasons I love podcasts and podcasts that invite some intimate listening between one or two people. And frankly, a podcast like this one, well, it attracts and requires someone who believes in attentive or active or mindful listening. And by that, I mean, as if you already don't know, a quality of listening to someone or something happening around you where you are open, receptive, and you have done some work to try and get your thinking out of the way. Now, this is something I do in all professional spheres of my life. A leadership coach, if you are one of those or have worked with one of those, well, a leadership coach listens to a client in a specific way. Of course, they listen to the client, to the story the client is sharing, the goals, the dreams, the hopes, the objectives they have for themselves and their career, the problem they are trying to navigate, or the quandary they are trying to discern their way out of. You listen to that story, but you also listen to the words they use to tell you that story, because word choice is very revealing when you start paying attention to it, because the phrases that we pick seemingly out of the air are not out of the air. They tend to come from a place deep within ourselves. And you also listen somatically. You listen to the way in which the person shares and conveys the story they are telling, what their body language is saying when they do it. Does their face light up, or do they deflate when they are telling you something that they want to do, yet nothing about them conveys that same intention? And if you're coaching a team of people, or let's say you're a priest or pastor and you are running a vestry meeting or a board meeting, or maybe you are presenting or preaching even, well, then you are paying attention and listening to the energy in the room that is shared between a group of people. All of a sudden, you might note that the people are really with you. They are completely connected, which is a wonderful feeling. And you also can tell the opposite when you have entirely lost them and they are nowhere near your heart. Maybe if you're in the middle of that meeting, or if you're coaching a team, like I said, you notice when anxiety enters the room. And you have to be that non-anxious presence that tolerates it long enough for whatever is causing the anxiety to be voiced. Anyway, these are just some of the many examples, and I know you have your own, of all the different ways that we listen with intention. And listening with intention is not only something that we practice and cultivate and learn, it is also something that requires a commitment to periods of silence and solitude. Now, I recently returned from a retreat. This particular retreat, and I've done many different kinds, but this particular retreat was spiritual in nature. It definitely falls under the religious category. I spent a week at Holy Cross Abbey in Berryville, Virginia, which is a community of Trappist monks. And if you know the name Thomas Merton, then you know what a Trappist monk is. It is a group of monks. They follow the Benedictine order, and they are cloistered, set apart, and their vocation is to worship and to pray. And they live in silence. Now, for the last 3 years, I have, I've been disciplined in going to a Trappist monastery once a year for a week. And yes, it is silent in a way that the rest of our lives definitely is not, but it's not as if you are not hearing and listening while you are there. You are hearing and listening when you are outside. The monasteries I've been to, one in Kentucky, Gethsemani, which is where Merton was a monk, one in South Carolina, Mepkin Abbey, and this one in Clark County, Virginia, on the Shenandoah River. Well, these monasteries were all on beautiful, expansive grounds, and I spent a lot of time outside listening to wind and birds and rustling of leaves and rivers, and it's cacophonous out there when you take out those AirPods or earbuds or whatever I'm supposed to call them and listen to the sounds that are all around us in the quiet. Now, it can be hard to be silent for sure. It usually takes me about 24 hours to kind of get into the rhythm of it. I inevitably bring one too many books. I bring a laptop that I realize I did not need to bring, nor do I need to open. Because when you get to a silent retreat, guess what? You get really, really scared about what it is you are going to do. Because this, my friends, is at the heart of cultivating that emptiness within ourselves that allows us to truly listen. In order to do that, we have to get comfortable with being with ourselves. We have to be unafraid to listen to what might come up when we are alone with our thoughts and maybe with a community that really invites us into a sacred space where we may be vulnerable in a way that we aren't when we're with other people, when we may allow ourselves to become a little more conscious of some feelings that we don't want to think about, let alone even feel. However, I have found that inevitably, even though, yes, there are some thoughts and feelings and reflecting on some recent ways of being that are difficult, that are uncomfortable for me, inevitably, the pervasive feeling I have in these times are awe and reverence, gratitude, all feelings that are also very vulnerable, by the way. It is hard to hold on to those feelings because, well, as Brene Brown says, we get really scared that they're going to be taken away from us with some bad news at the blink of an eye or the drop of a hat. But allowing ourselves to be in that space of gratitude and joy in that way, that's also a quality that is very good to cultivate and helps us in our listening. But actually, what I wanted to talk about specifically was what I learned when I went on a retreat a little over 10 years ago. I want to tell you this story because not only has it stayed with me, it's kind of a powerful story, but the more I reflect on it, the more I think about what happened and what changed because of it, the more I learned from it. And I think has some valuable insights that are, well, dare I say, worth sharing with the listeners of this podcast. So here goes. This was back in the spring of 2013, and I had arranged a retreat for the week after Easter. Now, if you are a parish priest, then you probably know exactly why that's a wonderful time for retreat. The number one reason is you are exhausted. Easter Sunday is exhausting enough. One headline once said in the Baltimore Sun that it is the Super Bowl Sunday for preachers, and that's a pretty accurate description in my opinion. Churches are packed on that day, and there is a lot of anxiety. Well, I have less of it now, but in 2013, I was only with my congregation for a year and a half. So high anxiety around what it is I would be preaching and hoping it would resonate with all those people in the pews. So there's that big day, plus Holy Week, which is comprised of a variety of different services, all of which are unique and kind of emotionally draining, quite honestly. And let's face it, pastoring or presiding, I should say, in worship is performative. And you're exhausted after Easter, or at least I'm exhausted after Easter. But it's the kind of exhaustion where you can't unwind right away. I am sure you know what I am talking about from your own experience. You have a kind of tired energy that you need to burn off. So I scheduled myself to be at a Carmelite monastery because thankfully I live very close to one here in Baltimore. Now, the Carmelites, if you do not know, are kind of the female version of Trappists. They too are cloistered and set apart, and their vocation is also to worship and to pray. And they too spend majority of their time in the great silence, long stretches of time, either individually on their own or together as a community. Whenever you're in either of these monasteries, for instance, there is no talking during meals, which when I tell this to people get, very nervous. Even the concept of being with a group of people and not speaking. How do you know if you need to help somebody? How do you know to ask where the salt is? I think silence just makes us anxious. But in truth, to have the freedom to sit with a group of people and not speak, well, it's a gift beyond measure. Think about your closest friendships, relationships. When you can sit with a person and be content not talking, it's a gift, right? It's a freedom to not have to make pleasantries, and it creates for a lovely sense of community. So I had booked myself at this Carmelite monastery. I think I was staying Monday to Thursday. And sadly, a parishioner's husband had died that Easter morning. And so I knew I had a funeral to do the Saturday that I would return. So not only would it allow me some time to rest and retreat, sort of recuperate, but it would also give me time to prepare for this funeral, which was going to be a rather large funeral. We needed to have the funeral in another church with more parking and more space. And I think this was my first time preaching in such a large church. So I was grateful to have this time. And at the Carmelite Monastery here in Baltimore, you have a lovely little room with its own kitchenette, its own microwave and toaster oven. They set you up with coffee and just sort of your bare necessities of what you would need to get through a couple of days. And I was there with a book that I fell in love with during that retreat. I think I've mentioned it on this podcast before. I can't recommend it highly enough. I've read it several times. It's called Where God Happens by the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. And it's a beautiful, simple but deep book about how the reality of God happens in the very ordinary circumstances of our lives. Very much, again, the way in which Brené Brown speaks to, we spend so much time chasing after the extraordinary moments in our lives when we truly learn how to practice vulnerability and joy when we note with gratitude the wonderful gifts that ordinary moments bring. Well, this book has a lot to do with that. So I was reading my book. I was praying with the sisters in the daily office. I was sleeping, getting some good naps. I will say one of the very first retreats I went on, I slept so very much. And I said to one of the brothers there, I apologized because I think I had slept through one of the worship services. And he laughed and said, that's what most people do when they come on retreat. They sleep because we don't realize how tired we are until we actually have a place where we have permission to do nothing. So I was sleeping, I was reading, I was praying, and I think it was in the morning. I don't remember what exactly I had read in the Rowan Williams book or why exactly this occurred to me, but I was wiping down the counter of the kitchenette. I had just made coffee and I had spilled a little bit of the coffee on the counter. And so I was wiping it down. And as I wiped down that counter, I noticed that I had also gotten some coffee in the actual coffee maker. And so I started wiping down the coffee maker. And then it just occurred to me sort of in this really all-encompassing way that, you know what? I was going to clean this coffee maker. I was going to wipe down this kitchenette counter. I was going to be the cleanest retreatant that had ever occupied, this is making me laugh, that had ever occupied this retreat space heretofore in the history of the Baltimore Carmel, which let's just think about that for a second. I mean, that's beyond ridiculous. And it tapped right into my perfectionist, people-pleasing tendencies, which also, by the way, allowed me to not stay present to simply being on retreat. What it did instead was immediately kick up my endorphins for some doing and the things I could do on this retreat, which would be to keep an exceedingly tidy retreat room. So I had this thought, I wiped everything down as best I could and, kept going about my day. So fade out, fade in. The day goes by and it's evening and I decide that night that I was not going to get a meal from the kitchen with the sisters. I was going to just stay in my room. Probably had the thought, given that earlier train of thought, that I'd be doing them a favor by, keeping to myself. So in the little refrigerator, they gave you frozen dinners. And one of the frozen dinners was some sort of fish thing or the other. And so I was going to make it in the microwave and eat this fish dinner. So I did that. And of course, when I was done eating it, I could really smell the fact that I had made a fish dinner. The whole room kind of smelled like fish. I think it was 8:00. It was 8:00 because 8:00 was the time when the great silence began. So, things happen during the day. The sisters have things to do. Sometimes they do teachings and lessons. They have meetings. It's community life, people. So there is talking in this monastery. But at 8:00, it is quiet. But I really wanted that smell of fish to be gone. And I didn't want it to linger in such a way that when the sisters came in, the next day, I didn't want it to be the case where the sisters came in and the room smelled like fish. I mean, my gosh, then I would have completely failed in my perfectionism of being the most perfect, retreatant. So I saw a can of Glade and I picked it up and I pressed spray. And the nanosecond, I pressed down the button to dispense that aerosol, my heart sank and my stomach dropped because the aerosol, it did not come out straight in front of me. What it did was it went straight up above me. And I knew that right up above me, there was a smoke detector. So right into the smoke detector shot this very strong aerosol. There was a heartbeat, a moment, a pregnant pause of silence. And then have you guessed what happened? an alarm system went off. The fire alarm system went off. And my friends, you haven't heard an alarm system go off until you have been in a monastery for 48 hours, not talking with a community of people in the great silence, and then you hear an alarm system go off. Oh my word. I was mortified, and I didn't know what to do, but I actually had been told exactly what to do, because when I had started the retreat, Sister Barbara Jean, she had gone through, the things I'm supposed to do as a retreatant, the door, the lock, the keys, yada, yada. And one of the things had been, if by chance the fire alarm goes off or there's an emergency, you are just to go straight downstairs and go outside. So I did it. There was nothing else for me to do. I had no idea how to turn it off. It was truly beyond my capacity. So I just went down the little stairs outside. I stood out there for a minute, but I knew there was no fire. I knew that I was the one that had set off this alarm in the community. So I don't know, after a moment or two, I went back up to my room. And as soon as I got to the top of the flight of stairs, down the corridor, I saw 3 of the sisters in their, it's a habit, but it's just like a white robe. They are running towards me with walkie-talkies and iPhones. Oh gosh. One of whom was Sister Barbara Jean, and she was laughing. I think she must have known that I had set off the alarm. And I just immediately started, talking and saying, I think I did this, and said whatever I said. The sister who's the head sister, I can't remember what that's called right now, but she did not find this humorous. At least that's not what her face conveyed. So everything was fine. They walkie-talkied whatever they needed to do. The alarm turned off. Sister Barbara Jean stayed behind, and I apologized. Oh my, so many, many times. And she kind of laughed a little bit more and told me, of course, not to worry about it at all. It was a mistake. Mistakes happen, and it's fine. It's fine. Now, did I really believe it was fine? Oh, gosh, no. This was long before I was even, I was not a certified Daring Way facilitator at this point. I had not even done some of the deep work that's needed to cultivate shame resilient skills. I had absolutely none. I don't think I slept very well that night. I, of course, was going to go to worship the next morning. I think I was leaving that following day. Oh my, I went to it's called Lauds. It's the morning office at 7 a.m. And I went to that with my head hung low. Sister Barbara Jean smiled. The minute she saw me, she reassured me everything was fine. I took her word for it. I did the prayers and I left. And, I was fine. The retreat was good. The retreat was still a really good retreat. And yes, there was a part of me that chuckled because, you see, I knew that in my framework of understanding my relationship with my higher power or God, that was a little bit of divine humor. That whole incident was a little bit of God saying to me, wow, Ariane, so you want to be perfect because you think that's what I'm after. You think after doing all the worship of Lent and Holy Week and Easter, you think cleanliness in a monastery retreat house, you think that's the whole point of resurrection and new life. So I knew I had some of my own spiritual growth and work to do. This was not lost on me. And as you can tell, I have thought about this experience many times since. There's a pretty well-known quote. I think maybe it's Tolstoy. We live life forwards, but we understand it backwards. But I have thought about this incident many, many times. Because not only did it wake me up to a tendency that I still have. I've been going on retreat, as I said, almost annually, disciplined annually ever since the pandemic. And let's face it, in some ways, the pandemic, we were kind of forced into some silence, weren't we? And a lot of us started doing things, didn't we? Right? We had to bake bread. We had to reorganize closets. This idea of simply being with ourselves or being in the household with the people we love. Well, that's, there's a lot of vulnerability there. It's really hard. And I still, that comes up every time I go on retreat. But as somebody now who has been working on cultivating shame resilience skills, who has done a lot of my own deep personal work on getting a little more comfortable with the wounds that I will forever and always carry, the things that trigger my feelings of vulnerability in some scary ways, and even the parts of myself that I just don't like, those parts of yourselves that you just don't like. And then when you're quiet and alone, you reflect on certain recent events where those aspects of yourself came to the fore. You probably acted in ways, or I've acted in ways that I regret and, knew I could have done better. All that stuff comes up when you're alone. So it was not lost on me, even then, way back then, that part of what I was trying to do with doing all that tidying and cleaning and ensuring there was no odor of fish in the room had to do with the busyness that keeps us from listening to the deepest parts of ourselves and listening to the still small voice within us. You can call it God, call it whatever you like, but that voice that always has our best interests at heart, even when it is hard. Well, I do think we need encouragements to retreat in whatever that word means for you. I think we need to be encouraged, those of us who care about listening well, encouraged to do the courageous work of taking time to step out of the busyness of our lives. And it is definitely a choice. We are all very, very busy. Even stepping out of the busyness of our lives for 20 minutes of meditation can seem daunting, right? And I want to just say one last thing about this experience, because another really transformative aspect that has everything to do with what I do now. Remember, I had said I had a funeral to do the coming Saturday at the end of that retreat. As I mentioned, this funeral was in a very large church, a church I had never presided in or preached in. It was rather intimidating for me. It was in front of a much larger group of people than I had preached in front of before. And it was a beloved parishioner. The widow was a beloved parishioner. And yeah, fun fact, you want to do well for these people that you serve. So I wanted to do a good job at her late husband's funeral. So I got to tell you, my friends, I attribute it to nothing else than the rhythm of quiet from that time. But at that funeral, that was the very first time that when the eulogy was shared, I could actually listen to it. Now, when I preside at a funeral, the way in which and I'm not the only one at all, but the way in which I lead a funeral is that whoever is going to deliver the remembrances or the eulogy, that happens before I deliver my homily. I don't really even call it a sermon because it's usually shorter than that. But at this particular funeral, I listened to the son of the man who we were giving thanks for and saying goodbye to. I really could hear what he was saying. I could really listen for the ways in which things he shared about his dad connected miraculously almost to me, connected with what I had written about in my remarks, and I hadn't known his father. I knew he didn't come to church. He was not a churchgoer. His wife was. So I didn't know the son, but then I had the presence of mind, which I had also never had at a funeral before, to speak to the people there, well, like I'm speaking to you. I didn't have to look at my written notes the entire time, and I was able to incorporate small parts of who he said his father was. I was able to connect that with the what I think is incredibly wonderful good news of how we are never separated from the love of God, even in death, and how that love stays with us and how we carry it with us. And after that funeral, I received a note from the son who sent his note with a book called Breathing Underwater by Richard Rohr, which is an amazing book. And he thanked me for the service, which was lovely. But he also suggested that we have coffee because he resonated with some of the things I said and yada, yada, yada. And so again, fade out, fade in, as my good friend Mark Collins likes to say. He's the reason I became a leadership coach because we developed a collegial friendship. We wound up working together once I became a Brene Brown facilitator. And what I think is important to share is that one of the things I've learned from choosing to go on retreat, to listen to myself, to listen to what the recent experiences of my life and maybe even some of the less recent experiences of my life might be trying to get me to hear, to listen to the still small voice, and trusting that being in that sanctuary of solitude, having nothing to do with a church building, but being in that sanctuary of quiet, you receive something that you bring out into the world with you. Receptivity, awareness, clarity, presence. And that is a necessity for attentive, loving listening, which is a feeling that I don't mind giving some thought to from time to time, because I lose sight of it before I even realize I have lost sight of it, because life gets very, very busy and sometimes very overwhelming and scary and anxiety provoking. And we can't always stay, or I can't always stay in that vulnerable place of receptivity and awareness. It's a little too vulnerable, quite honestly, and I need sometimes to protect myself and distract myself. And I'm just a human being after all. So that's what I wanted to share. I wanted to share a small story. Well, it's a small story, but it's meant a lot to me and it's taught me a lot. And as someone who has spent considerable time realizing the power of taking in other people's stories, how they are healing and hope generating and life affirming, and also someone who shares stories in a variety of ways and realizes that's part of what I do in the world, I wanted to share this story with you. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being present with me on my podcast for this episode. And whatever book I have mentioned here, you're going to find it at bookshop.org. As we are still in this wintering season, at least when this episode will go into the air, perhaps you want to consider an invitation to retreat. You can make a retreat in your home if you want to. And maybe you have some listening of yourself that would be a valuable, fruitful way to do something good and giving for you. All right. Thanks again for listening.